This happened to myself and a close friend just last month. We decided to go on a 2-night backpacking camping trip in the Adirondack Mountains of New York. We were both very comfortable with nature and spent a lot of time camping, hunting, fishing, etc. We hiked about 5 miles into a small lake and set up camp on a small beach. This was not a heavily trafficked area, and we did not expect to run into anyone. Our first night there, as we were sitting around the fire, we saw a flashlight moving on the other side of the lake around 10:30. This was fairly unusual, however, we did not think too much of it. But as time went on, this flashlight kept moving around the lake, getting closer to our campsite. We kept discussing who could possibly be wandering around the woods in the middle of the night. We did not particularly want an unwelcome guest. Once it was clear that the person or people were heading for our campsite, we moved off into the woods nearby to see who would wander up. I took a small axe with me, and he had a .22 rifle. Now, we weren't expecting trouble, and we certainly didn't want to make any. We figured we might as well cover our base. Now, the moment of truth. The flashlight come near the lights of our fire, and it is one man. He has a beard, and is probably in his mid-40s. The scary part was, he was carrying what turned out to be a pump-action shotgun. He walked around the campsite a few times, and then he proceeded to enter our tent. After rummaging around for a minute or so, he came out and started yelling, "I know you're out there. Why don't you come and say hello?" My friend and I remained motionless under a hemlock tree around 50 yards away. That is when the man proceeded to fire his shotgun into the woods, not too far away where we were. He also swung his flashlight around several times. After what felt like hours, he grabbed my friend's backpack and a few articles of clothing we had drying off near the fire and threw them into burn. My friend, who had trained with the .22 rifle, was aiming it at the man, asked me if he could shoot it. I told him absolutely not, unless he spots us and starts to point the gun in our direction. Thankfully, the man moved off from where he had come after a little while. We waited until his flashlight was on the other side of the lake. We ran out, grabbed everything we could fit in my pack, and took off. We ran out the trail with flashlights and made it back to my car as the sun was coming up. We immediately went to the police department and reported it, and where we also spoke with some forest rangers. That was it. I haven't heard anything back from the police. It wasn't mysterious. However, it creeped the hell out of both of us. This story happened about 2 years ago while I was in university working on my degree in biology. I had signed up for a trip to gather samples for an experiment some students in the ecology department were going to run. It required the collection of samples from several sites, so they recruited biology, ecology, and forestry majors to help them complete the sampling in a shorter period. The area my group was to take samples from was a few hours from my uni in the Pacific Northwest. There are 9 of us in my group, 8 students and a supervising professor. We got to the campsite in the late evening and set up our tents. One of the other students had brought a big container of split pea soup from home and was sharing it with the others on the trip. I don't really care for split pea soup, so I declined the offer. Everyone had some except me, one other student, and the professor. Come the next morning, the 5 students who had eaten the soup were in the best of shape. They were in the grips of some gnarly food poisoning, and were in no shape to hike for 8 or 9 hours to collect the samples we needed. The professor who was supervising us had originally some rules, such as people travel in groups of at least 2, and we had to return to camp by nightfall. Now those rules were tossed out to make sure we kept our timetable and collected all of the required samples. We were just told to, quote-unquote, do your best to complete the work assigned as long as you can do it safely. That morning I set out for a long time of hiking. After a mile or so, I ran into the stream I was supposed to follow. I needed to travel about 4 miles upstream, stopping every quarter mile to collect samples of the water and soil. This meant I had to hustle to get back before dark. Halfway through the day, I realized that wasn't going to happen. About 2 miles into my hike, I stopped for lunch, sitting on the log overlooking at the stream. The scene was very peaceful until I smelled a cigarette. It wasn't the smell of a cigarette being smoked, more the musty smell of a heavy smoker's car, where cigarette butts has been left to ferment for weeks on end. I looked around, but couldn't see anyone. I just assumed that the wind had blown the scent of some hunter or hiker over to me. But minutes later, the smell hadn't faded. The vegetation in the area wasn't that thick, but there was still a lot of places for someone to duck behind a tree or bush. I was unnerved that someone was apparently staring close enough to me for me to smell them for this long without so much as a word. I quickly packed up the trash from my lunch and continued up the stream. The musty cigarette smell went away for the next few hours. It wasn't until I arrived at my last sample location late into dusk that I smelled it again. The woods were getting really dim by this point. Looking back on it, it was a really stupid idea to stay out so late. Just hiking back to camp in the dark would be pretty dangerous, even without a cigarette smoking stalker. Having just put the collection tools in my bag, I shined my flashlight around the darkening woods, looking for whoever was giving off that smell. I didn't see anything that caught my attention. It would actually be more correct to say I saw too many things in the dim light that might have been a head sticking out from behind a tree, or someone crouched low in the foliage. I didn't like the idea of being in the dark woods with a stranger who, for the second time, was lurking near me without revealing themselves. So, I began to double time it back down the stream. I made a much better time on my way back, even though it was dark, because I didn't have to stop to take any samples. Even so, I didn't get back to camp till a bit before 10. That was the last one to get back, and everyone but the professor was already asleep. I didn't mention the cigarette smell to the professor, because he seemed tired as it was, and he headed to his bed in the RV. Soon after I got back, I headed to my tent soon after. And at some point in the night, I woke up needing to pee. I decided to head into the woods to do my business, as I knew some of the other students were still feeling ill, and I needed the RV toilet for more urgent matters than just having to take a leak. I walked about 100 feet into the woods, found a tree, and did what I needed to do. As I turned to go back to the camp, something caught my eye. Somewhere off in the woods, where was a tiny red glow. I was confused as to what it was until it flared momentarily, and I realized it was the cherry of a cigarette. I stood there for a while watching the red ember glow, fade then move slightly closer to the ground as whoever was smoking would take it out of their mouth. Not being able to see this person, I assumed they were watching the camp. I didn't know if they had seen me make my way into the woods or not, as the fire has been dosed and the moon was only half full, so there wasn't very much light. I made my way slowly back to the camp as quietly as I could and entered the RV to wake up the professor. I told him about the person smoking in the woods and about the smell of cigarettes earlier that day. However, when we got outside the RV, the ember from the cigarette was gone. My professor woke up the other students who hasn't calmed down with the food poisoning, and we took turns watching over camp. I didn't see or smell anything else while I was on guard duty, and went to sleep when the professor woke up for his turn. In the morning, the professor, the other student, and I went to where I guessed the smoker who had been standing the night before, and sure enough, we found about 10 cigarette butts on the ground next to the tree. The tree itself looked like someone who had been twisting and stabbing a knife or other sharp objects into it, as the bark and outer layers of wood had been damaged and chipped away. The professor decided that the group should head back that day, even though we hadn't collected all the samples. We were assigned to be on the safe side. We packed up camp and drove down the thin dirt trail without incident. The second we got onto the paved highway, though, a white panel van pulled out of a clearing just off the shoulder and began following us. This van stayed behind us all the way back, pulling off the highway when we did, taking the same surface streets that we did, and only stopped following us when we turned onto the road leading to our university campus. Everyone was freaked out by this, but it was around 9 at night on the weekend, so the security office on campus was closed. We decided to unload the RV and call it a night, as the van had followed us onto campus. I offered to help the professor catalog and store the collection tubes from our trip, so it was another couple hours before I left the biological science building and started heading towards the dorm building I lived in. I stepped out into the cool night air and began walking, my professor having left the building in the other direction to get to his car and drive home. It was a couple dozen feet outside of the building, which was now locked, when I was hit with a musty smell of old cigarettes. I looked around, and about 25 yards away in the darkness, off of the footpath, I saw the cherry of a cigarette smoldering away. I was pretty scared at this point, but hoped it was only a student or some faculty staying late having a smoke. I couldn't completely convince myself of this, as the musty cigarette smell was the same as what I smelled in the woods the previous night. I started down the footpath and soon passed whoever was smoking. 100 feet or so later, I looked over my shoulder and saw the cigarette cherry bobbing in the darkness. The smoker was following me. This creeped me out a bit more, but I still held it together. That is until I rounded a small stand of trees and saw a white panel van parked alone in the parking lot. I took off at a sprint toward my dorm building. I looked over my shoulder a few steps into my run. I saw the cherry of the cigarette fall to the ground and a dark shape begin to move after me. I didn't look back again, but I could hear someone running in the grass off of the footpath. I got to the entrance to my dorm building and was frantically waving my keycard in front of the card reader that controlled the door lock. As soon as I hear the soft beat, I opened the door, jumped through the door my way, and shut the door quickly. I stopped and peered through the glass door. I saw the dark shape stop just short of the lit pathway. I just watched for a minute or two. Then I saw the spark of a lighter. The light is just barely bright enough to illuminate a shaggy beard and brim of a baseball cap, before it disappears and was replaced with the red glow of a cigarette. I turned and headed up the stairs to my dorm room. By the time I get to my window overlooking the same yard I had just run through, there's no trace of a dark figure of a cigarette cherry. And after that, I didn't see that white panel van again, or smell that musky cigarette smell, and I hope I never do. I love camping. Anytime my friends and I came home from college, we would load up our cooler with beer, grab some gear, and go screw around outside. Unfortunately, when I was actually at school, none of my sorority sisters or other friends ever wanted to go with me. So, I would often suffer withdrawals from camping. One day the weather was way too nice to waste, so I grabbed some of my gear, hopped in a car I borrowed from a buddy, and drove to a spot that was secluded yet within a safe distance to civilization that I could run and get help. Camping also creeps me out sometimes, but that creepy feeling is also somewhat of a plus for me. It's the same reason that people read these stories. It's fun to be scared. So I make a little camp and get a fire going. I haven't brought all that much to eat, but I was enjoying myself. Reading and looking around the area, that sort of thing. I got the feeling I was being watched, and I stopped dead in my tracks. I heard a twig crunch over to my right. Then I see a dull bolt for 100 feet or so in front of me. I laughed at myself and went back to the camp with the armful of wood I had gathered. I kept freaking myself out, hearing sounds just outside the ring of lights cast by the fire. I always get inside my head, so I shrugged it off and kept whittling at a stick I had been messing with. Around 1, I decided to go into my tent and snuff out the lantern. I have been slumming beers in the most unladylike fashion and smoking cheap cigars. Another reason why I like camping. I can act however I want. I passed out relatively later. Around 2 o'clock, I start hearing footsteps. They sound pretty light and sort of timid. I think to myself, it's a deer or other animal, more likely a raccoon, because I have probably left some food out. I'm still on guard though. About 30 minutes of sleeping with one eye open, I hear a rubbing noise, and the tent fabric is being pushed in a bit. I don't know how I didn't shit myself in my sleeping bag, but I just sat there, paralyzed, with my kabar in my hand. I desperately wanted to thrust the knife through the tent fabric while I was still holding out hope that it was some of my buddies from a frat joking with me. And then suddenly, as it had begun, it all stopped. It was starting to feel slightly more secure, because daylight would be coming in about 2 or 3 hours, while I sure as shit wasn't going to go to sleep. Now all of a sudden, at about 4 o'clock, I realized I should put my boots on, so that if anything did happen, I would be ready. After having stayed up and keeping alert a little while longer, my friend's car alarm goes blaring. I freak the fuck out and run out of the tent. It got about 2 steps before something grabs me around the mouth. I open my mouth to scream, but instead the person's pinky finger slips between my teeth. I heard that people can perform superhuman features when they have huge adrenaline rushes. In my case, I just clamped down, and there's no way to say this without sounding ridiculous. His finger popped off. He screamed, pulled his hand away with the missing digit falling to the ground. He looked off running down the hill. I was camping on. I took off right quick in the opposite direction. I must have looked ridiculous to the people whose house I ran to. A little sorority girl in a wife beater, boxers, and steel toe boots. I also had some blood that I oozed out of my lip, not from the finger, but because I also managed to take a pretty good chunk out of my lip as well. I told them what happened. They called the police, got me some real clothing, and the man at the house made me a whiskey and coke. When the cops got there, they checked it out, and when they came back, it was light out. They brought me back so I could get to my friend's car, and what I saw just made me more scared. Right next to the tent was a red gas can. He could have just lit me on fire earlier. The finger was also gone, suggesting he had come back. The kicker is that they never caught the guy. So somewhere out there is a man sitting down at dinner, maybe alone, maybe with a wife and a couple of kids, and he's missing his right pinky.